In a world where justice is often reserved for the privileged, a young boy steps forward, alone in a courtroom that feels far too big for someone so small. He's only 4 years old, yet the weight of the moment bears down on his tiny shoulders like an unbearable burden. His white button-up shirt and neatly pressed beige pants, carefully chosen by his mother, serve as a silent testament to the gravity of this day. He is not here to play. He is not here to be a child. He is here to fight, for his father, for his family, for the truth. The courtroom is cold, sterile, and unfeeling, its walls steeped in history, its air thick with the expectation of formality. Towering above him sits the judge, her expression unreadable, her authority absolute. The boy's large brown eyes scan the room, taking in the hardened faces of attorneys, the hushed whispers of spectators, the unshaken presence of those who believe justice is predetermined. But he does not care about their expectations, their power, or their rules. He cares only about the man sitting behind bars, the man he calls Daddy, the man who has been accused of a crime he did not commit. His father is not a man of wealth or influence. He is a man of quiet strength, of relentless work, of love so deep that it forms the foundation of his son's world. Every morning, he wakes before the sun, his hands calloused from years of labor, his body weary but his spirit unbroken. He asks for nothing but the chance to provide, to give his son the kind of life he never had. Yet here he is, shackled by a system that does not see him, imprisoned by accusations built on nothing but prejudice and assumption. The prosecution paints him as a desperate man, a criminal who took what wasn't his because life had left him no other choice. The defense, overwhelmed and outmatched, can offer little more than a token argument for his innocence. Here, in this place where power and privilege dictate fate, the truth is a whisper lost in the storm. But then the boy speaks. His small feet hesitate as he steps forward, his fingers gripping the edge of the podium for balance. His voice, at first barely more than a whisper, carries the weight of something much greater than himself. "Please, ma'am," he says, looking up at the judge with eyes too full of sorrow for a child his age. "My daddy didn't do it. He didn't hurt nobody. He was just trying to help." The room, once alive with murmurs and shifting papers, falls silent. The judge, a woman who has seen countless cases and heard countless pleas, feels something shift inside her. She has dismissed many words in her courtroom, categorized them as unreliable, emotional, irrelevant. But there is something different about this boy, something in his unwavering sincerity that forces her to listen. "My daddy works hard. He's good. He's not a bad man," the boy continues, his voice growing steadier, more certain. "He wouldn't hurt nobody. I know it. He wouldn't." The truth in his words cuts through the courtroom like a beam of light in a storm. He is not reciting a script. He is not telling a story rehearsed for sympathy. He is simply speaking from a heart that has been broken by the injustice before him. And in that moment, for the first time, the weight of the system falters. The judge shifts in her seat, discomforted not by the boy's words, but by what they reveal. How many times has she ruled based on evidence presented by those with resources, those with power, those who could afford the best defense? How many times has she overlooked the voices of the poor, the forgotten, the unseen? This child, with his small hands and trembling voice, is forcing her to confront the flaws in a system she has upheld for years. The boy's father watches from across the room, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and pain. He did not ask for this. He would have shielded his son from this burden if he could. But in this moment he sees something unbreakable in his child, the same quiet strength he has carried his whole life. The boy does not know the intricacies of the law. He does not understand the weight of legal arguments or the power dynamics at play, but he knows what is right. And he knows that if he does not speak now, his father may be lost forever to a system that does not care about innocence, only about verdicts. His love for his father is a force stronger than fear, stronger than injustice. And as he stands before the judge, his voice small yet unwavering, He reminds everyone in that room of something they have long forgotten. Justice is not in the hands of the powerful. It is not a privilege for the wealthy. It is in the courage of a boy who dares to speak the truth. As he walked down the aisle of the courtroom, the murmurs that had filled the space moments before began to die down. One by one, the voices of the adults around him faded into silence, their attention drawn to the small figure moving forward with hesitant but determined steps. The boy's footsteps echoed through the vast chamber, each one hesitant yet resolute. He was small, fragile even, in a place where power and authority loomed large. Lawyers, witnesses, and even the judge, a woman known for her sharp intellect and unshakable demeanor, watched him closely. They had expected an adult to take the stand, someone seasoned in the art of argument and defense. No one had anticipated this, a child, standing alone, preparing to speak for the accused. Yet despite his size, despite his innocence, the boy carried an unseen weight, something that made him seem more at home in that courtroom than anyone else. His presence alone shifted the air in the room, but no one fully understood just yet the impact his words would have. Reaching the witness stand, he struggled to climb onto the seat, his small legs barely managing to pull himself up. The moment his eyes lifted, they locked onto his father, sitting in the defendant's chair, weary yet unbroken. The sight of him made the boy's heart ache. His father had already suffered so much, had endured trials no one should have to face, and now this, another battle where the odds seemed insurmountable. The weight of the world pressed down on both of them, but the boy's gaze remained steady, his decision already made. He would not fail his father. A thick, unnatural silence settled over the courtroom, a stillness so deep it felt as though time itself had paused. All eyes were on him. The judge, so accustomed to maintaining order, found herself momentarily thrown off by the quiet strength radiating from the child before her. She exuded authority, but the boy did not shrink under its weight. He had learned in his short life that authority was something to be met head-on. And now, with everything at stake, it felt as though he held the power, not the adults surrounding him. His throat tightened, but he swallowed hard and took a breath. Then, with a voice that trembled but did not waver, he asked the question that had been burning inside him since the day his father was arrested. "If my dad was rich," he said, his voice small but clear, "would he still be in trouble?" The words struck the room like a thunderclap. The air seemed to shift, the walls closing in around the weight of his question. It was not just a child's inquiry, it was an accusation, an indictment of the very system that had placed his father in that chair. The question cut through the carefully constructed arguments, through the rehearsed testimonies and layers of legal jargon. It was not a question about laws or statutes. It was a question about fairness, about justice, about whether the world was truly blind to the differences between the rich and the poor. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was suffocating. The judge, usually composed, blinked several times, visibly unsettled. The attorneys, who had spent days crafting their cases, suddenly found their carefully prepared words meaningless. The spectators, some of whom had already dismissed the boy's father as guilty, now sat frozen in the wake of that one simple, devastating question. The boy had broken the unspoken rule that children were to be seen and not heard, especially not in a place like this. And yet, he had done more with those few words than any argument made in that courtroom. The judge pressed her lips together, struggling to regain her composure. The child's question was simple, yet it held the weight of something far greater than this case. It was not just about his father. It was about every person who had been crushed beneath the weight of a system that did not see them, that did not protect them. It was about the way justice bent and twisted under the influence of wealth, about how fairness was often an illusion reserved for those who could afford it. She had spent years presiding over cases, making difficult decisions, and upholding the law. But this was different. This was not just a trial. This was a reckoning. The boy's father sat motionless, his face a mix of hope and anguish. His son, this small, brave child, had spoken not just for him but for so many others who had never been given a voice. The judge exhaled slowly, her carefully built walls beginning to crack under the weight of his words. "You are wise beyond your years," she said at last, her voice softer than before. She glanced toward the father, then back at the boy, her gaze searching, thoughtful. "Your question is one that demands careful consideration." But the boy was not done. His eyes, still locked on hers, did not waver. "If my dad was rich," he repeated, his voice steadier now, "would he still be in trouble?" His question was no longer just a plea for an answer. It was a challenge. It was a call to acknowledge what everyone already knew, but refused to say. The silence in the room deepened. The prosecutor, so confident minutes ago, shifted uncomfortably. He was a man who dealt in logic, in evidence, in rules. But this was something else. The boy had forced him to confront the truth he had spent his career avoiding. Was he fighting for justice, or was he merely enforcing a system that protected the powerful? Even the defense attorney, who had spent the trial tirelessly fighting for the father, found himself unable to speak. The case had shifted. This was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about the fairness of the system itself. The judge inhaled deeply, glancing at the prosecutor, then at the defense. She knew in that moment that she could not simply proceed as planned. Not after this. Not after the truth had been spoken so plainly by a child who had nothing to gain, but everything to lose. "I've seen enough," she finally declared, rising to her feet. "This case will be reassessed." A ripple of whispers spread through the room, the weight of her words settling over everyone. The boy, still perched on the witness stand, did not fully understand what had just happened. But when he looked over at his father, he saw something there that hadn't been present before. Hope. His father stood, walking toward him with slow, measured steps. When he reached him, he knelt, pulling his son into a tight embrace. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be all right." Outside the courtroom, the boy's words echoed far beyond those walls. His question, so simple yet so profound, had become more than just a plea for his father. It had become a voice for those who had none, a challenge to a system that had ignored them for far too long. And in that moment, the world began to listen. Was justice truly blind, or was it weighed down by bias, class, and status? Back in the courtroom, the recess had ended. The judge, a woman of quiet authority, returned to her seat, her expression unreadable. She had spent the last several minutes poring over the evidence, conferring with her colleagues, and searching for the truth within the tangled web of facts and allegations. Now, the time had come to deliver her verdict. A hushed stillness settled over the room. Every eye was locked on her, every breath held in anticipation. "After thoroughly reviewing the evidence and considering the concerns raised," she announced, her voice steady and resolute, "I find that the charges against the defendant do not hold. The case is dismissed, and I hereby exonerate Mr." She spoke the boy's father's name with finality. Her words landed like a thunderclap, rippling through the courtroom. Relief surged through the air, thick and tangible. The boy's father stood, his face a canvas of raw emotion, his eyes welling with gratitude. His son watched him unmoving, his small body tense with the weight of what had just transpired. Applause erupted from the courtroom, yet the boy remained still. His gaze never wavered from his father, as if ensuring that this moment, this long-awaited justice, was real. His unwavering courage had not only freed his father, but had also forced the court to confront a painful reality. The judge's decision was more than just a ruling. It was a reckoning. It forced those present to ask themselves, was justice merely about following laws, or was it about truly understanding fairness? The boy's question had shaken the very foundation of their beliefs. As the father stepped forward, his eyes met his son's, and in that gaze was everything: love, gratitude, and the unbreakable bond forged through pain and perseverance. He swept the boy into his arms, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it," he whispered. But the boy shook his head, his voice firm yet tender. "We did it." In the days that followed, a single question echoed through courtrooms, newsrooms, and conversations across the city. If my dad was rich, would he still be in trouble? It was a question so simple, yet so piercing, that it left even the most hardened individuals unsettled. It exposed an uncomfortable truth, that justice, the very pillar upon which society was built, often bent under the weight of wealth, privilege, and status. The boy had dared to ask what so many feared to voice, and in doing so, he held up a mirror to a system that too often failed those without power. This moment was not just about his father's freedom. It was about the countless others who had stood in that very courtroom, who had faced judgment, not just for their actions, but for the color of their skin, the weight of their wallets, or the neighborhood they came from. The boy's courage ignited a spark, a demand for accountability, for reform, for a justice system that truly lived up to its name. The judge's decision was a victory, but it was only the beginning. Real change would not come from a single case, a single ruling. It would come from a collective awakening, from people daring to ask the hard questions and refusing to accept injustice as the status quo. This story is more than a courtroom drama. It is a testament to the power of truth, to the courage of a child who refused to be silent in the face of unfairness. His innocent yet profound words cut through the complexity of legal arguments and exposed the cracks in a system that so often failed those without wealth or influence. In a world where justice is supposed to be blind, this boy's question forced us to confront the truth. The scales are not always balanced. Too often they are tipped in favor of those with power, leaving the most vulnerable to fight battles they should never have had to face alone. But this child, this fearless, unwavering child, challenged us to look deeper, to question the fairness of the systems we uphold, to ask ourselves whether we are truly building a society where all are equal under the law. His voice did not just save his father. It became a rallying cry for those who had long been unheard, a reminder that true justice is not just about laws and verdicts, but about the humanity at the heart of each case. This story compels us to reflect. How many times have we witnessed injustice and remained silent, thinking it was not our fight? What if we, too, found the courage to speak up, to challenge unfairness wherever we see it? The boy's words were not just a plea for his father. They were a call to action for all of us. Are we willing to dismantle the biases that shape our world? Are we ready to build a system where wealth and status do not dictate fate? The conversation begins with us. Justice should never be a privilege reserved for a few. It should be a right guaranteed to all. If this story moved you, share it, discuss it, reflect on it. What can we do today to challenge the injustices around us? Let's not just witness change.